Thanks, Jim, and thanks for having us. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to just speak for about 10 minutes or so and then hand it over to Ted. So as Jim mentioned, Ted and I are the authors of the book, When the World Closed Its Doors, the COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders. We both have strong ties to Canada, and we live about 20 minutes drive from the Canadian border. So we decided to write this book for both personal and professional reasons, but largely because when COVID happened and many of the borders around the world were closed, we were incredibly impacted by that here in this northwest corner of Washington where we live. We also looked around and we did not see a whole lot of scholarship or kind of retroactive analysis being done on the impacts of the use of borders during COVID. So we felt there was a lot of important stories to tell, both from the policy perspective, but also just from the perspective of the individuals and the human impacts that were sort of the collateral damage of a lot of these approaches. So the book really tries to highlight the personal experiences of people who were separated around the world by these policies that lasted quite a long time. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to kind of set the context, a little bit of background. 5 years ago was a long time ago for some of us, especially if you experienced the sort of COVID time warp as I did. So I'll just sort of ground us in what happened 5 years ago and walk us through a little bit how countries responded, which is all things we address in the book, and then hand it over to Ted. So it was exactly 5 years ago, March of 2020, when COVID was declared a global pandemic. And that was a declaration put in place by the World Health Organization. And at that time, the World Health Organization had recommended against using any travel or trade restrictions during a public health emergency. So there had been numerous times in the past when there had been these public health emergencies of global concern. And the World Health Organization, which is, of course, the multilateral organization that puts out these recommendations, strongly advised against using borders as a response to this type of event, including COVID-19. About 20 years ago, in 2005, 2006, the World Health Organization and its member states had agreed to something called the International Health Regulations, which very clearly stated that countries committed to not imposing more restrictive measures than what the World Health Organization would recommend, especially in the absence of scientific justification. So we were entering this phase where we were having this global pandemic, and sort of mostly all of the multilateral and even bilateral agreements in how countries should respond recommended against using borders as a policy response. And this was also true at the regional scale. So the European Commission came out very strongly against using border restrictions, initially sort of writ large, and then they shifted a little bit to said, okay, well, maybe we could have a fortress Europe, but we certainly should not impose any type of border restrictions within that Schengen area of free movement. In North America, we also had an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which very similarly argued that, maybe there could be some screening done in airports, but the land borders in particular on both US northern and southern borders are incredibly long, incredibly difficult to sort of shut down or to do any real monitoring. So that agreement also said that we will work together, we will share information, and using borders to control a global pandemic is just sort of not the most effective means, and it has a lot of collateral damage as well. So we sort of knew that there could be problems with using borders, but what actually happened pretty early on, by I think April of 2020, there was 194 countries around the world that had decided to put in border restrictions anyway. Many of those were sort of a mix of either total closures in very specific cases, like China, for example, eventually, or measures that maybe were very loose. So Mexico, for example, sort of agreed to border restrictions with the United States, but in theory, very little of that was actually put into practice. So there was a diversity of responses ranging from sort of more restrictive to less restrictive. But at the end of the day, the majority of countries around the world had some type of border restriction or border closure, despite sort of this agreement by many of them that this was not an effective tool. Another key component of the policy response on borders during COVID was this desire to keep goods moving. We saw a little bit of a dip in international trade and movement early on in the pandemic, but for the most part, goods kept moving across borders. And this was a really important distinction for governments to put in place to enable goods to continue to move while restricting the movement of people. And something we highlight in the book is sort of people could get their Peloton bikes, but they couldn't drive across the border and see their grandmothers or their ailing parents. But this distinction between allowing goods to move and not really allowing people to move was sort of politically popular, right? Because people could still get the goods that they wanted, even if they couldn't cross the border as easily in physical sense. There was also a really important distinction that we get into in the book quite a bit, which was governments deciding what was essential and could be allowed to cross the border versus what was non-essential. And some countries had stronger guidelines than others. The United States was quite vague in what they considered to be essential versus what they considered to be non-essential. So a number of the stories that we tell in the book, particularly in the North American context, come down to this sort of arbitrary nature and how that played out on the ground. So I'll just give you one example. We have a very interesting community out here in Washington State called Point Roberts, and it's a little exclave. So it's actually at a US territory, but attached to Canadian soil. So the people living in Point Roberts have to pass through Canada to get to the United States. So during COVID, when Canada and the United States had their border heavily restricted for well over a year and a half, more or less, people living in Point Roberts had a very, very difficult time crossing the border. And we heard multiple stories of situations where somebody would show up at the border, and again, this is the Canadian border because they had to pass through Canada to get to the United States. And they'd say, I need to get to the United States because I have a dentist appointment, for example. This is one story. And the officer at the booth would say, well, is it an essential dentist visit or a non-essential dentist visit? So you could sort of see how these types of mechanisms, which were completely up to the discretion of the officer in the booth at the border at the time, created a lot of not only inconsistency, but also a lot of hardship. And there was, of course, much more heartbreaking stories of people who were not able to travel back and forth to say goodbye or farewell to loved ones. So the book tries to capture these human impacts in various parts of the world. And we do look at sort of more extreme cases and less extreme cases. So without getting into all of them, we talk about New Zealand and situation in New Zealand where even New Zealand citizens were not able to return home for a period of time. They had a complex hotel quarantine system where if you were a New Zealander living abroad and you were trying to come home, you had to essentially put your name into a lottery and maybe you'd get lucky enough to get a space in one of those hotel quarantines, or maybe you would continue to be sort of trapped overseas. So one of the questions we raise in the book is, what is citizenship if it doesn't allow you to sort of even return to your home country? And then a less sort of extreme case was South Korea that was able to actually do really adequate domestic public health protections through contact tracing and quarantine. So they didn't have to sort of rely on borders as a way to restrict movement. So that gets to one of the key arguments in the book, which is that borders are usually not the place to sort of solve a variety of challenges, but they are a politically popular tool that allow governments to really sort of say, we're protecting our own while we're keeping foreigners out. And in reality, on the ground, you know, the policy goals and the policy tools may be very disparate. One really key piece that we looked at in regards to this conversation today, asylum seekers and migrants, was the use of a policy called Title 42. This was a policy that was invoked by the United States early on in the COVID days to essentially say that asylum seekers at the US borders pose a potential public health risk. And so by putting in place this policy. We are basically saying that because of public health risk, we will not process any asylum claims. So Ted and I interviewed the director of global migration at the time at the US CDC. It's a very interesting story because this policy arrived on his desk and he read it and he said, I refuse to sign this order because what you're doing is really putting in place an anti-immigration policy. This is not about public health at all. The interesting thing about Title 42, and I think Ted will sort of talk a little bit more about this as I hand it over to him, is that it really allowed, sort of set the stage for the US government to test out ways to, virtually end the asylum process, or at least bring it to a grinding halt. And it did that on the grounds of public health. So we are sort of seeing this already happen again in the new administration. And some of the things that we warn about in the book was that the US will move into this extreme version of some of these things that were sort of tested out during COVID. And unfortunately, I think it's sort of taking off at even a quicker pace than we anticipated it might have when we started writing this book just several years ago. On the Title 42, because this was, again, this is sort of, I think, maybe with this group and this topic, the most relevant component of what we saw during COVID, which was using public health as an excuse to sort of implement this anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker policy. And we've already seen it happening with the Trump administration. And one thing I really just would like to read real quick, since we lost Ted anyway, we have a few minutes, is the Supreme Court ruling on whether or not Title 42 should be something that would continue or not. And there's a lot of context to that, but I think this applies very much to some of the things we're seeing today. And I just would like to read really quickly Justice Gorsuch ruling on this. And he said, doubtless many lessons can be learned from this chapter in our history, and hopefully serious efforts will be made to study it. One lesson might be this: fear and the desire for safety are powerful forces. They can lead to a clamor for action, almost any action, as long as someone does something to address a perceived threat. A leader or an expert who claims he can fix everything if we only do exactly as he says can prove an irresistible force. The current border crisis is not a COVID crisis, but rather is an emergency decree to sign for one crisis in order to address an entirely different one. But if emergency decrees promise to solve some problems, they threaten to generate others. And rule by indefinite emergency edict risks leaving all of us with the shell of a democracy and civil liberties just as hollow. And this just really sits with me very much so today, because we are seeing these executive orders and these emergency statements, especially regarding borders, as really laying the groundwork for eroding a lot of protections, not just for foreigners and for asylum seekers and migrants, but domestically as well. So I wanted to make that point before we handed off things.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurie. Hardin, you want to jump in?
Sure, with pleasure. And, Ted, if your connection restores, of course, just ping us and get back in and jump into the discussion. Laurie, that was just, that's an incredible, I read that, the section a little bit again. It's an incredibly powerful quote, and it's incredibly germane to the current moment. I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting quickly before we get into this, I guess what Steve Bannon and others have referred to as the muzzle velocity around the issuance of these kind of executive orders and the moves that have been made around the border and on asylum and on foreign assistance that have sort of really kind of changed the landscape in which many of these conversations are operating. And just to sort of say, we did a ton of work at Refugees International around the COVID crisis, right? And we're very much involved in a lot of these debates and discussions about, oh, Ted, you're back. Do you want to jump in and give your...
No, keep going, Hardin. I don't want to interrupt, so I'll
That's
follow
okay.
up. So just, keep it. Sorry for the problems. Hopefully this will work better. Different computer.
Okay, well, you sound great. That sounds like it's coming through really well. So again, feel free to jump in at any point on this. Just put your hand up and I'll turn the mic over. Just to step back for a bit before we get to the current day, all of the trend lines around global displacement that we saw sort of emerge and change and shift a bit around the COVID crisis I mean, a lot of those movements in the progression has just really gathered steam, right? So right now, we're up to like 120 million people forcibly displaced globally. There's only about 43 to 44 million, depending on your count of them, like refugees, people who've crossed borders and who are like a prima facie case for, or like a good case can be made that they are in need of international protection under the traditional refugee convention. But these numbers are a huge, like the level, the growth in forced displacement, whether it be internal or across borders, has just continued to gather steam, particularly in the last couple of years. I mean, again, if we're up to 43.4 million refugees or higher, and then if you look at the asylum case, like I think it's 3.6 million asylum applications globally, stepping back in 2023 and 2024. And then the backlog systems to try to address those people who are seeking asylum, we're now at a case where you have like 6.9 to 7 million people globally, in those backlog situations, like waiting to have their cases adjudicated. So the system itself continues to be like the size of the problem is growing, and the system that's designed to deal with it continues to be sort of overwhelmed. And one of the big things that's interesting to me, having worked on this for a number of years, is watching what's driving this, right? Like, so we've had a part of our organization that's worked on climate displacement for 13 or 14 years, because we've always seen this as going to be like a prime driver of global forced displacement over time. And yes, that is happening in a big and significant way. Economic adjustments, all kinds of things are driving global forced displacement, but really we're seeing huge like spikes in things like conflict that are really like contribute to this dramatically. And here, like the crisis in Sudan, or the war in Sudan, the war in Ukraine, these conflicts, and now we're quite worried about what we're seeing in Ethiopia, potentially what we're seeing in DRC. There are a number of new crises or new wars, and then festering conflicts that look like they're beginning to boil over, that are really beginning to drive a lot of forced displacement in ways that we hadn't seen for a couple of years prior to all this. And this is big and significant, in particular in this moment, because the traditional mechanisms, and as Jim was very kind in his overview, I spent a ton of time working in the UN system, and largely around humanitarian response, but also around peace and security interventions. The architecture that's there at the multilateral and global level to deal with challenges to peace and security, along the lines of what we're seeing in DRC, along the lines of what we're seeing potentially in Ethiopia, in Sudan, those tools just aren't doing their job, or they're no longer fit for purpose, right? And so like there was a period of time when, for better or for worse, a number of, say, peacekeeping missions were deployed in the tens to respond to these kind of crises and wars. The council just isn't there, and some of those tools are proving ineffective. So the things that we would like to see done, or even international diplomacy to lower the temperature in these conflicts and to lower the level of forced displacement, aren't there. And it's leaving all of it to the international humanitarian and international refugee architecture to manage. So against this, right, like you now had in the United States, and after the first Trump administration, the Biden administration actually made a reasonable amount of progress in trying to rebuild and restore some of the more traditional mechanisms like refugee resettlement and humanitarian assistance that we use to deal with refugees who are being resettled in the United States, or dealing with refugees who have traveled to countries of first refuge, or the crises in which they're occurring. And they used interesting tools, complementary pathways in particular, to open up other avenues to receive some form of international protection. Here, thinking about Afghans who were fleeing Afghanistan when the collapse of the government, Ukrainians, what's called CHNV. So these are Haitians, Venezuelans, Cubans, and Nicaraguans who are fleeing particular forms of conflict and state collapse, who are offered parole, which is an executive branch or that allows for a certain period of time people to seek safety in the United States, and then using other mechanisms like temporary protective status to extend those protections over time. So you saw sort of a lot of creative instruments that were brought to bear to try to make this happen. Again, lots of people in my community pushing the administration very hard, the Biden administration, hard to do more on a number of these fronts. Now, fast forward to the current day, what we have largely seen at the moves the Trump administration has been making, I think both can best be characterized as sort of doing what they had done the first time, particularly what Laurie and Ted have really articulated in their excellent book and also in their presentations. That's on steroids, right? Like what we're seeing is all these different forms, like shutting down. I can talk through it in just a second. And that's being coupled with an almost an extinction level event with respect to U.S. foreign assistance, right? So USAID, having sort of shuttered their doors or being put through the wood chipper, we'll see where all that lands. But the immediate interim effect has been quite significant and will probably grow over time. So in essence, what you're creating is like a global pressure cooker around forced displacement, where some of the traditional avenues for seeking safety aren't there, and then the kind of assistance you're going to get are no longer, the plug's been pulled on that. So just to step through carefully some of the points that Laurie presaged, right, in her remarks about, and what the book has anticipated, but then also what Gorsuch saw, almost a full suspension of asylum rights in the United States. Administration effectively eliminated the rights of seeking asylum by suspending entry at the southern border and making drastic shifts to U.S. Asylum policy. Mandatory detentions in many cases for non-citizens suspected of immigration violations. You now have to be detained until deportation can take place. And that is having, like, a lot of the alternative programs we use to manage this issue are no longer on the table, probably to the benefit of a lot of private prison contractors. The use of the U.S. military in this role. The U.S. military is now enforcing immigration law and detaining migrants at Guantanamo Bay and using military aircraft for deportations in a way that we really haven't seen before, right? I mean, there have been, it's been done in certain ways in certain places, but they're really leveling up the role of the military in this component. And then another interesting thing is the expedited removal nationwide. So previously, you would use expedited removal, which is a way of sort of moving people through, without getting, so the normal hearing process, moving people out of the country, it only really applied to people who are injured at the border. Now, anyone who is unable to prove that they've been in the United States for 2 years, with 2 years of residency, and has some issues around their documentation, can be pushed into the expedited removal process. And that, is raising some very serious concerns for people who work on migrant and asylee rights. Other thing that we are really beginning to grapple with, and we'll spend a lot of time on in the coming months, is the elimination of parole, right? So the programs aiding what I was just talking about for Venezuelans, for Haitians, for Afghans and others, that parole window has now been shut, and you have hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, here in the United States who are trying to survive on temporary protected status, which in many cases has also been canceled. And so when we're looking forward, what we're anticipating is a major effort by the Trump administration to forcibly remove these people from the country, or creating incentive for them to self-deport. And that is liable to really affect a series of different communities where these people live, diasporas, families, but also, quite frankly, businesses, right, who depend on these people who have the right to work in the United States, who are going to have these ripped out of their communities. And the other big move they're doing, very similar to what they did before, in terms of the externalization of U.S. migration control. And this is policies like Remain in Mexico, which has been reinstated. And you're also facing a number like migrants from Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan are being deported via third countries like Costa Rica, Panama, which is effectively sort of outsourcing a lot of the immigration enforcement in the United States. So you have sort of a pivot back, but then a leap forward in the types of tools that are being utilized, and with relatively less sort of success in the court systems in challenging some of these. Couple with that, what's happening on the humanitarian aid front, right, where the unplug of foreign assistance and the wood chippering of USAID has led to fairly dramatic consequences in a number of the countries where we work or where we have eyes on the ground. Dan, I think one of my colleague, Dan is maybe on this call. If not, Dan Sullivan, yes, he is. He just got back from Bangladesh. I just got back from Syria. Another colleague just came back from the Horn of Africa. And what we're seeing in context of forced displacement, right? Dan was just in the camps in Bangladesh, where WFP, because of these aid cuts, is now having to ratchet down food aid quite significantly after having already just done it. And this has led to massive concern across both on international aid providers, but then also Rohingya communities themselves about their ability to survive in those camps in Bangladesh. In Syria, I was in a number of internally displaced camps where communities like 120,000, 100,000 large IDP camps, where people are wrestling with the dilemma of now they no longer get water trucking, or they no longer get food aid, brought in, or the hospital that served them now is at 20% capacity as opposed to 80% capacity. And so they were pooling what few resources they've got to try to buy a water truck, to have water trucking, commercial water trucking brought in. But there's a very clear ceiling on their ability to continue to do that. And it's having a time when the country's under sanctions, so their ability to actually rebuild and respond to the massive destruction that would allow them to return home is non-existent. So again, like it's a microcosm of the pressure cooker. And we are anticipating, like in healthcare and other sectors, and I can go into detail if we've got time afterwards, about the potential level of mortality or excess mortality that is likely to result from this. I think the Center for Global Development just did a quite interesting study on this that I think put it up conservatively at 3.3 million additional annual deaths due to the loss of US funding. And we can unpack that methodology, but if you take that and like the humanitarian suffering that is represented inside of that figure, coupled with the closing of borders, again, not only do we have like very serious normative concerns, but there are some peace and security concerns as well in terms of the overall stability. Now, I've got some ideas we can talk about way forward, but I've definitely gone over my 10 minutes and so I'll stop there, turn back to Ted if he wants to elaborate, and then I can talk a bit more about what I think might be the way forward, if that's helpful during the Q&A. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Hardin. Between you and Laurie, you've covered a lot of ground here, so I'll just add a few things and we can get into the discussion. As I was saying, one of the big takeaways from the book you've highlighted in your comments here, and that is the limitation of border measures for solving big problems. I mean, one of the things that has happened with the new Trump administration is that they inherited a remarkably secure southern border. And it was precisely because the Biden administration did all of the things you talked about, a very sophisticated mix of sticks and carrots. And there were parts of those sticks I know your group and others did not like in terms of the difficulty of people who cross the border illegally applying for asylum. But from the Biden administration's perspective, they needed to change the incentive structure by offering new legal ways for people to arrive and trying to close down the ways that the administration didn't want people crossing the southern border illegally. What we saw during COVID was a similar kind of lesson. If you wanted to control COVID infections, it's not that border measures were irrelevant, but they only worked where they were combined with other effective domestic public health interventions. South Korea being a superb example, Taiwan being another. Now, if you take a country like the United States, we closed our borders reasonably effectively, but had one of the highest death rates in the world because our domestic public health response was a disaster. People might point and they say, well, New Zealand and Australia had pretty low infection rates, despite what experts would call a mediocre public health response. And that is true, but A, those were very easy countries to seal because of their island status, and B, there were enormous human rights consequences to this, including keeping citizens from returning home, as Laurie mentioned. And that same lesson, I think, holds for drugs. We're seeing the use of these trade weapons in an effort to stop fentanyl smuggling. There's not a single case on record of border measures successfully lowering drug use. In fact, what we saw during the pandemic was the opposite. Because it was harder to get bulkier drugs smuggled through the ports, the cartels moved heavily into fentanyl. And we saw a huge increase in fentanyl overdoses during COVID, in part because it just became the more available and cheaper form of opioids. So you're not going to solve the drug problem at the border. Hardin's talked very well how you're not going to solve this massive global displacement problem with border measures. I wrote after 9/11 about terrorism, and one of the reasons that we've been able to minimize the sort of threats we saw in 9/11 in the aftermath is that countries have really cooperated to try to identify travel of concern and intervene in effective ways. Again, a very collaborative effort. So border closures don't get you very far without these other measures. Just a couple other points I'll make quickly. I think when the history books are finally written, COVID is going to come to be seen as a big chapter in the accelerating breakdown of global collaboration and the rise of more aggressive forms of nationalism. We are, I've been teaching my students about this for some years with a sort of question mark. Are we moving into a period that looks a little like the post-Spanish flu period, the post-World War I period, in which We saw a huge increase in trade protectionism, huge increase in immigration restrictions. The sort of question in a lot of my teaching is, are we moving into a period like that again? I think unfortunately it's not really a question anymore. I think we are moving into a period like that. It may not look, one hopes, exactly like that period, but there's an awful lot of parallels between the retreat from globalization we saw in the 1920s and 30s and the retreat we're seeing now. Just a third quick point, again, one that we're seeing very much here in the United States today, is the danger of the abuse of emergency powers. I mean, Laurie talked in the Point Roberts case or along the US-Canada border of the absolute power that COVID gave border officials to make decisions about who could cross and who could not cross, what was essential, what was non-essential. In the more extreme cases in Australia and New Zealand, in the context of emergency powers, governments were even able to do something that was once unthinkable, which was to keep citizens out. And it really showed the world the ways in which any sort of declaration of emergency absolutely pulls all of the constraints off of government officials and the agents who are enforcing government policies. And we are seeing this right now in the United States. I mean, President Trump has in effect declared an elaborate state of emergency. I can go into the particulars if people want. And it's allowing abuse of executive authorities at a level I'm not sure we've ever seen in this country. And COVID showed us the danger there. I will leave on one more positive note. Our policy chapter. So this is a Council on Foreign Relations book, and one of the requirements for a Council on Foreign Relations book is you have to have, hopeful policy recommendations. And I sort of took a first cut at that and started writing about, the need to rebuild the international health regulations and strengthen the WTO. And Laurie looked at it and she said, A, it was boring, and B, it's ridiculous because that's not going to happen. And we went a very different direction, talking much more about citizen activism and what people can do. And there were encouraging stories out of the pandemic about, couples and families separated, lobbying their governments successfully for exceptions to allow families and couples to reunite. And the way we ended that chapter was on a slightly hopeful note. What we saw during COVID was those of us lucky enough to hold privileged passports, Americans or Canadians or Europeans, suddenly found that we were the victims of the same sort of border authorities that people from poorer countries, people dealing with forced displacement, trying to escape to safe situations, they've been dealing with this for decades. And so our hope in the book is that we may begin to see some solidarity. We were talking about this with Jim before the session started. I don't know if you've been reading the stories about, Canadians being detained by ICE here in the United States, Germans, British, others. I am hoping that there will be a growing recognition that the sorts of powers we have given to border officials are not just dangerous for those from poor countries fleeing desperate situations. They're in fact dangerous to all of us, and that we need to find ways to rein in those sorts of de facto emergency authorities that these officials are exercising. So I'm, in a strange sort of way, despite the horror of all these stories, I'm hoping that there will be a broader sense of solidarity among those who, for whatever reasons, whether out of desperation or because they want to work or study or be tourists, all of us who move across borders need to recognize that we actually have something in common, and we need to fight, I think, for a privilege that too many of us have taken for granted. So let me stop there. Jim, again, sorry for the technical difficulties. Thank you, Hardin, for making it so easy for me.